Good afternoon. Welcome to this Policy Exchange webinar. Lunchtime here in London, breakfast time for our guest and lecturer, Ed Glaeser, who has kindly joined us from Boston. My name is Trevor Phillips. I am a senior fellow here at Policy Exchange and part of the project which we call Liveable London, which we are relaunching today. I think most people on this call are here because you know about Policy Exchange, but for those who do not, it is probably fair to say, and anybody here in London knows that I'm hardly party pre here, it's probably fair to say that Policy Exchange is the most influential think tank in the UK, certainly with the current government, which is not my party, but its work on a whole series of fronts has been extremely significant on cultural issues, on issues of community cohesion, which I've been myself involved in, but more relevantly for today, perhaps, much of the work on building beautiful, as well as some of the economic and social policies of the current administration. We are thinking very hard at the moment, not just about where we are today, given the significance of COVID and of course departure from the EU, but also what comes next. And I would say that the relaunch of Liveable London falls very squarely into that category. There's been a great deal of conversation over the last few years about divided societies, North America, here, other parts of the Anglosphere, as well as throughout Europe. One way of describing that division has been between urban and rural. And of course, there are even further subdivisions between cities and towns. But within the United Kingdom, there's absolutely no question that one of the great divisions, both in terms of opinion, preference, configuration, complexity of management of space, as well as population and economic indicators, has been London versus the rest of the UK, both as a pillar of the economy, but also as a cultural leader. And so the question of what next for the capital, where does the capital go, what are the challenges it faces, particularly post-Brexit, but not purely to do with that issue, and how should we best prepare for it, I think will be looming very, very large over this coming year. And it's with that in mind that I'm delighted to welcome my colleague on the Advisory Council of the Liveable London project, Professor Ed Glaeser, to speak to us in a moment. It would be banal, I think, to describe Ed Glaeser as a Harvard economist. He is that. He is the professor, the Fred and Eleanor Glimp professor at Harvard and director of the city's research group. But he is also a prolific author. And in fact, if you Google him, it will take you the best part of a weekend just to read the titles of his many articles during his 30 or so years at Harvard. He is, by the way, the author of a forthcoming book, Survival of the City, Human Flourishing in an Age of Isolation, which he tells me is going to be in the hands of discerning individuals by March. But more importantly, from my point of view, I first came across Ed's work in relation to segregation. British listeners and viewers will recall, one of my own small penetrations of the public consciousness related to the issue of segregation and how serious it was in this country. And during that imbroglio, I should perhaps call it, I did take the trouble to read some of his work, which was, in my view, groundbreaking and has never been given quite the prominence and significance that it deserves, in which, and Ed will correct me if I'm wrong, he essentially made the point that in the United States, segregation itself has made probably the most profound impact on African-American fortunes compared to almost every other factor that has been adduced. And I thought it was an extremely important piece of work, and still remains an important piece of work. But aside from that, much of his work has dealt with the economy, the architecture of cities. He's the son of an architect, I should say. And most importantly, the contribution of the diversity and character of cities to the economy. So I, for one, am extremely keen and anxious to hear what he has to say that will point us in the right direction. Ed, welcome, and I hand the floor to you.
Thank you, Trevor. And I'm so glad to be having this dialogue with you. I'm just sad that it's not in person. I think if there's a central message today, it is that the age of the city is not over. And London's greatest days may well be ahead of it, and may well be ahead of it soon. But we should not in any sense overlook the enormous headwinds that all cities face. The fact that in an age of Zoom, we can go in from anywhere, I think will not mean an end to the urban life, but it does mean that capital is mobile. It does mean that talent is mobile. And in that world, livability is more important than ever. In that world, the ability to be a great city that is not just a place of productivity, but a place of pleasure is an enormous asset. And as we know, London has been delivering pleasure for centuries, and it has an ability to come back as really a great capital of the information age. And I believe that it will. I believe that Liveable London will play a major role in helping to advise policy of this. And I'm very proud to be part of that effort and proud to be part of the policy exchange family. So let me start with three figures that are very pre-COVID. The first one that I'm going to show you is taken from the NUTS 3 regions of the European Union. Could we go to the first slide, please? Okay. First, of the European Union, and what you see along the horizontal axis is the density level of each one of these regions. So there are about 1,113 of these regions, and they are organized from least dense to most dense. What you can see in the blue line is the relationship between per capita GDP and density. So the densest 10th of these regions have incomes that are on average twice as high as the least dense of these regions. This is something economists call agglomeration economies, the fact that we become more productive by being enmeshed in a maelstrom of economic activity. And that is indeed what London offers, and what has helped London to be vastly more productive by most measures than most other parts of the United Kingdom. The red line is a somewhat more surprising fact, which is the relationship between population growth between 2000 and 2010 and initial population density levels. So whereas Americans at the start of the 19th century were leaving their dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces between the oceans, instead of spreading out, we are clustering in. We are moving to places that are already crowded. And that really, I think, shows the appeal of density despite the rise of telecommunications. Next slide, please. Before COVID, this was what I was worried about most. Over the past 50 years, there has been an enormous rise in prime age male joblessness in the United States. Prime age is defined by the US Census as being between 25 and 54. And I am sure that Trevor will agree with me that that is a highly offensive definition of prime age at this point in time. But that is their definition. And in 1967, roughly 1 in 20 prime age males were jobless, 5%. For most of the past 10 years, 15%, 3 in 20 prime age males have been jobless in the US. So it's been a massive rise. Joblessness is a curse that is far worse than just earning a lower income, because of course, work gives you both social ties and a sense of purpose. And all the data that we have shows that joblessness is associated with misery, with divorce, with opioid abuse, and with suicide. It is of course not spatially neutral. you can see here that the coastal cities of the US are light, right? Meaning they have relatively low levels of joblessness. But there are inner areas, in particular, a swath of states that begins down in Louisiana and Mississippi, runs up through Appalachia, and then ends in the Rust Belt cities of the Midwest, where in many parts, 1 in 4 prime-age men are jobless. This is really the epicenter of American economic dysfunction. This is the place in which prime-age male mortality has been going up, life expectancy has been going down, and it really relates to this fact that, I believe that cities, through the face-to-face service economy, have the ability to deliver jobs as long as there are entrepreneurs with imagination for people in that service economy. But I have no idea what less skilled Americans are going to do in West Virginia, in Mississippi. And in some sense, that's the fear that we all have of what could go terribly wrong with COVID if pandemic becomes permanent, is in some sense, without that face-to-face service economy, all of the world starts feeling like West Virginia. And next, please. Now, the last point that I want to emphasize is about the rise of housing prices. And this shows a map of England, shows you the map of, and it shows the ratio of prices to incomes. And as you can see, prices are very, very high relative to incomes in and around London. In some sense, this is not just a sign of the economic vitality of London. If the economic vitality of London were all that were going on, then the incomes would be high and you'd expect to see the same ratio of prices to income everywhere. But in fact, that's not the case. In London, like in many parts of the world, in our most successful cities, we have seen housing prices, the cost of living going up faster than incomes. On one level, this is a problem that I will return to later. It's a problem that stems from a failure to supply enough housing. And it is a major policy failure. But on the other hand, is an indication of the desire of people to live in London, the desire of people to be in this beautiful and great city, which has this ability not just to enable us to earn a quick buck or to trade on the financial bourse, but also to meet with our friends, to eat at an exciting restaurant, to go to an amazing gallery. All of these things are made possible by the sharing and connection that happens so readily in cities. Next, please. But of course, the same cities that enable face-to-face interaction also enables face-to-face interaction of viruses and bacteria. There are many demons that come with density. High traffic congestion, crime, but the most terrible of these is contagious disease. And this has been stalking the urban world for thousands of years. This image is actually a Poussin painting of a biblical plague, but it is often used to connote the plague of Athens, which struck that most glorious of Mediterranean metropolises in 430 BCE. If you'll remember, the backstory for that was the Peloponnesian War was about to happen. Pericles had come up with a cunning strategy, which was to summon his Attic allies inside the walls of Athens and allow those walls to protect him against the Spartan hoplites. At the same time, they sent out the Athenian fleet to harass the coast of the Peloponnese. What happens, of course, is that the hoplites do not get through. The Spartan army is stopped, but a bacteria does get through. Enters through the port of Piraeus and devastates the city, perhaps 1/4 of the population dead within 2 years. Pericles himself killed. And really just a massive blow to the city that had shown all that cities can do at their best. The creativity that gave us Athenian philosophy and drama and the creation of democracy itself and art, right? All of these things that happened when people were close to one another, when people learned from one another, right? Also could get struck down so quickly. And in a sense, Athens never recovered from the plague. It would eventually lose in the Peloponnesian War 25 years later, and its brightest days really were not yet to come. An even darker picture of plague and the urban world happens a millennium later. In 541 CE, when Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague, makes its first appearance on European shores, the backstory for this is the Emperor Justinian had sent his great warlord Belisarius out to reconquer Italy and to reimpose the Pax Romana on the Mediterranean world. But just as this is happening, the Black Death shows up and devastates Constantinople. Belisarius becomes just another warlord. Europe descends into military chaos. And in some sense, the back lesson for this is that plague is much more devastating when it hits a period that is already uncertain, right? The pre-existing discontents of American cities made them less capable of dealing with this pandemic than they were 20 years ago of dealing with the terrorist attacks of 2001. Next, please. But in fact, for most of the past, I would even say 650 years, European civilization has proven to be relatively robust to pandemic. The Black Death that struck in 1350 did not, in fact, cause economic or political chaos. And in the 19th century, cities built and rebuilt themselves in order to protect themselves from the plague. The early 19th century was a period of globalization in its own way. And the clipper ships that traveled the Main carried with them contagious diseases. For example, yellow fever probably came from Africa in a barrel, made its way to the Caribbean, and then came north to the United States. Fairly devastating disease in the early part of the 19th century. And then, of course, cholera shows up. It probably mutates into its deadlier form in the Ganges Delta around 1817 and slowly makes its way across the world. You can see here the cholera epidemics punctuating themselves. But what happened was the cities of the West invested an enormous amount to try and fight cholera. The original investments were based not on medical knowledge, but medical ignorance. The primary school that held sway was the so-called miasma school, which argued that both yellow fever and then cholera came out of the ground. Right? They were not an example of contagion at all, but when ground was fetid or disgusting, then diseases came, which led them to believe in aqueducts and sewers and piping and a lot of things which were in fact exactly the right thing to do, even though they got the science wrong. And they, of course, the case for sewers became much stronger after Dr. John Snow understood the waterborne nature of the cholera epidemic by studying the pattern of deaths around the Broad Street pump in 1854 in Soho. You can see here the Croton Aqueduct is marked there. The Croton Aqueduct was the great piece of water infrastructure built in the 19th century in New York, followed, of course, by the sewers. But you can also see something interesting, which is that the death rates don't immediately come down after the Croton Aqueduct. For 17 years afterwards, you're continuing to have pandemic after pandemic. It's only after 1866 when the Board of Health starts imposing rules on the tenement owners that they have to connect to the water system, that you actually start seeing that change. And it reminds us that you don't just need infrastructure, you need rules to make sure people use that infrastructure. When I do work on water connections in sub-Saharan Africa, this is what we see, is that the wealthy world subsidizes the existence of a water main, but nobody bothers to make sure that the last mile problem is solved. Consequently, poor households continue to drink water from shallow wells and continue to use pit latrines and continue to get waterborne diseases. You need both infrastructure and institutions, and sometimes you need to spend an enormous amount. America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water and sewers as our national government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army in 1900. Public health does not come on the cheap. And I think looking forward, given the $16+ trillion cost of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is worthwhile spending billions to make sure that this never happens again. Next, please. Now, when the COVID pandemic first struck the United States, it felt like it was a very urban pandemic. This was the early rollout of the cases as of April 30th. And as you can see, highly concentrated around New York with a couple of other major metropolitan areas showing up, because cities are the nodes of the great lattice of global travel, and diseases come in first through the cities where they're then spread by urban density. Next, please. And this just shows the relationship during those early months, this is up through May, between population density across American counties and COVID-19 prevalence. So the early rollout was really very prone to hit dense areas. But, next please, this was a disease like the influenza pandemic that came a century ago that can strike everywhere. And for much of the last 3 months, it has been disproportionately in places like the Dakotas and lower density parts of America. This really has as much to do with behavior as it does of density. And as denser areas shut down their movement, they became safer. Next, please. Nonetheless, in the developing world, you still see this very strong connection between density and prevalence. This is the relationship between COVID cases and the share of the population living in a favela, which is an informal low-income settlement in Brazil. Next, please. This is the relationship between population share living in slums and COVID prevalence in India. Somewhat amazingly, the work of Anup Malani and his co-authors, which has done serological work, testing for antibodies in Indian slums, finds that by July, in some Mumbai slums, more than 50% of the population had already had COVID. That in fact, they actually did follow the herd immunity strategy because they didn't have any other option. And in fact, while it was in many ways terrible, the death rates weren't as high as you would expect in the West because you don't have as many old people and because obesity is not nearly as prevalent. Next, please. Density is also not as important as behavior in cities like New York. So I don't know how much everyone understands the map of New York. I assume not everyone has the map of New York ingrained in their dreams the way that I do, but this is New York, that white long sliver in the upper left-hand corner, that's Manhattan. And as you can see, that white there suggests that it's actually fairly low levels of COVID cases. The darker areas are the outlying boroughs. That's the Bronx, right up in the top center, and towards your right, that's Queens, and towards your lower left, that's Staten Island. Those are all areas in which you had higher COVID cases. Now, what's somewhat interesting is, of course, these areas, the areas that have the higher COVID cases, those are areas which don't have skyscrapers. Those are areas where density is lower, not higher. And it reminds you that density is not destiny on this. What spreads COVID is personal contact that is unprotected, and the denser areas were actually able to self-protect more. Next, please. This shows the reduction in the number of trips. We luckily have an amazing amount of cellular phone data which shows us how mobility changed after the COVID pandemic struck. And as you can see in the lower areas of Manhattan, in the denser areas, that's where mobility just shut on a dime. These areas are wealthier, they're more likely to work in knowledge industries where people were able to telecommute and they were able to shut down faster. Next, please. This shows the relationship between change in trips and cases. Our estimates are that during this time period, for every 10% more that you were able to reduce your trips, it led to a 20% reduction in the prevalence of COVID cases. So really a very strong connection between reducing mobility during the early years and COVID. Now, the work of Robert Barrow on the 1919 pandemic tells us that the social distancing rules that cities followed then don't appear to have reduced the overall mortality, they just appear to have flattened the curve. So this may not, in fact, impact the long-run mortality, but it certainly did flatten the curve. Next, please. And this just gives you a sense across a series of countries about how much we shut down. So we've got Brazil, the US, Mexico, Italy, Germany here, all of them showing an incredible reduction in the amount of mobility. This is visiting retail and recreation. In a sense, cities are the absence of physical space between people. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. And social distancing is the opposite of that. Social distancing is essentially de-urbanizing our world on a dime. Next, please. This shows you the relationship between what kind of work you did and your level of reduction. And I'll come back to this later. But this shows the change in the share of trips versus the share of people who worked in essential industries across New York City zip codes. Again, the people who worked in essential industries like medical professionals were just not able to reduce their travel. And of course, they were much more likely to get sick. And the share of people who worked in occupations that permitted teleworking, that had delivered services that could be done over Zoom, they moved less and they were healthier. Next, please. Now, one of the things that is interesting is that most of the time, people shut down their movement before there were rules. And this is something that should give us a little bit of pause about thinking that the government really has the ability to dictate the amount of economic activity that happens. This is from Couture, Dingel, and Handbury. They're looking within Pennsylvania. And as you can see, you have a shutdown in both highly educated and less educated mobility that happens long before the actual lockdowns are in place. The lockdowns happen much later. We've seen this in our Brazil work as well, that there's almost no correlation between the local lockdown rules and how people move about. The one major exception is that to that was the American Sun Belt, where when cities like Florida and Texas undid their lockdown orders, they said restaurants were okay to open, young people rushed back out to those restaurants. That ended up having very deleterious effects, as in fact, they ended up getting very sick. But it seems that those young people took the state reopening message as a message that it was safe, that it was all clear, and consequently they responded to it. But but of course, Florida did that without what New Zealand did before unlocking, which was to actually test the asymptomatic. And you can't really know if a plague like COVID-19 is gone until you actually have widespread, serious, random testing of the asymptomatic. That's the only way you can know it's gone from the population. Florida didn't do this, but I think many of those restaurant goers were either just desperate to get out again, and I'll come back to that later, or willing to take on faith that if the government said it's okay to go out, it's safe. Next, please. Now, switching to the economic impacts of this, and of course, it is an economic catastrophe as well as a health disaster. In some sense, our long-term economic evolution has left us maximally vulnerable to this pandemic. During the Black Death, again, one of the great tragedies of human history, but not an economic catastrophe. In a subsistence farming economy, the amount of wealth per person is really intimately tied to the amount of land per person. And so if the number of people died, land per person goes up, and people were wealthier after the Black Death. During the factory economy that we saw 100 years ago, the last time that we had one of these events in 1919, there was a short, sharp recession, but it was very quick. Very quickly, the factories got humming again. And for a number of different reasons, an economy in which you sell goods is just much less vulnerable to plague than an economy built around face-to-face services. And those services, those jobs selling a cappuccino with a smile, proved an employment safe haven in a world of mechanization, in a world of outsourcing. And it is fantastic that cities allow the possibilities for people who don't have a degree from Massachusetts Institute of Technology to earn a living by selling a restaurant, by selling food or selling a coffee or selling a beer. But those jobs can vanish in a heartbeat when the smile that used to bring pleasure becomes a source of peril. Next, please. This just shows that evolution. I've broken up the US economy into 5 broad bins. You can see the bottom one at the end is manufacturing, which declined from 17.5 million jobs in 2000 down to 12.5 million jobs. That's part of an even longer secular trend. Manufacturing employment hit its high point in 1979 in the US and its highest share in 1943 of the US economy. The middle 2 lines are leisure and hospitality, which has been rising. That's the yellow line, and retail trade, which has been stagnant. Those are the face-to-face urban service jobs. They represent 32 million workers, or 1/5 of America's employment pre-COVID. Those are the most vulnerable sectors. The top 2 lines are education and health services. So those are by and large public jobs, which tend to be a little bit safer. And then the top line, which is professional and business services, they're the lucky ones. They're the ones who are able to zoom their way to economic survival. Next, please. Together with a series of co-authors, we engaged in a number of surveys of small business owners starting in April. And what we saw was really carnage. In our first April survey, we saw that 45% of the businesses were closed and 37% of them expected to be closed at the end of December. Our latest survey will be out very shortly, so I'll be able to update you on this pretty soon. Of course, huge differentiation. Professional services, only 27% of them were closed. But banking and finance, only 19% were closed, but 70% of arts and entertainment were closed. 53% of all retailers were closed. So huge amounts of heterogeneity. Next, please. And this switch to Zooming has left many people wondering this question, which is absolutely critical for the future of the city, which is, will the boost in remote working become permanent? And this just shows the decline in the share of people going to work in different jobs. This has been a question that I have grappled with almost all of my professional life. Alvin Toffler in 1980 wrote a book called Third Wave, in which he predicted that the rise in fax machines and telephones and so forth would mean we would all decamp to electronic cottages and just dial it in. Now, for 40 years, Toffler has proven to be wrong, that in fact, the office, face-to-face contact, connection, downtowns have proven to be resilient in many ways. Next, please. In some sense, I always argue that what the era of globalization and new technologies have done is that they radically increase the returns to being smart, and we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. And that in a world in which ideas became more complicated, the easier it was for things to get lost in translation, and the more valuable being in the same room actually was. You know, just speaking personally, I can somewhat communicate information via Zoom, but I have no idea how to inspire a 19-year-old about mathematical economics via Zoom. It just doesn't have the same emotional bond. And those emotional bonds are part of any decent employer who's actually trying to get more out of their workers. Now, we do have a series of interesting papers looking at the productivity impacts of COVID. I think some of the best papers, which are somewhat misleading about the overall economy, have looked at call center workers. So there's a very good data on call center workers, and because you know what you want from these workers, which is how many calls they manage to take a minute. And typically, the studies have found, and the first person who did this was Nick Bloom at Stanford. This is from two students of mine who looked at a major American retailer. Typically, what you find is that when you send people home, they actually become more productive. That because they know exactly what they're supposed to do, they know that they're supposed to make calls, they actually do more of it at home. There's no sense that they're learning anything or not learning anything. They're just making calls and they're able to do it perfectly well from home. And that's just true. And you can see this is the line that goes up. This was true pre and post COVID, and this was true when they had an experiment earlier on. It is also true that the workers that get hired for remote jobs tend to be less productive to begin with. So you tend to get workers who are less committed when you hire and say, look, you never have to show up, which is one reason perhaps why businesses resisted moving to an all remote work model, as they thought they would get workers who were only marginally committed to the firm. It is also true that in the long run, and here you can see the remote, and this is on your right-hand side, the blue and the red lines. The first line just shows what probability you get moved up to a very mid-level position, and the lower line show your probability of getting promoted to a high-level position. The ones who are live are much more likely to get promoted to a high-level position than the ones who are remote, which does suggest that even though your short-term productivity may actually be higher at home, your long-term ability to learn and grow as an employer, as a person, I at least believe, this seems compatible with the view that this is something that is done by being there, by being in person, by being live. Next, please. Another thing which is interesting and perhaps speaks to the ability to learn is that this shows both employment from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and new hire postings from Burning Glass, which is a virtual universe of online postings. This is from work from a student of mine, Morales-Arilla, and his co-author, Daboin. And they split occupations, as we did earlier, into those occupations that can be done remotely and those occupations that cannot be done remotely. The non-remote occupations had a massive drop in employment, that's the red line, and in postings when COVID struck. But both employment and postings recovered in the non-remotable industries. The remotable industries, employment stayed relatively steady, but new postings dropped and they have stayed down. Firms are not trying to hire people for these jobs. So whereas Microsoft says, oh, our programmers are perfectly productive when we send them remote, overall hiring for computer programmers is down 40% in the US as a whole relative to pre-COVID, which means they're not hiring new people on, perhaps because it's difficult to embed them in the firm's culture, in the firm's world, without having them actually live. Next, please. Another point to emphasize, if you imagine a world that does not have real live-to-live cities, you're imagining a world that is even more terrifyingly unequal than the current world, right? Because in fact, Zooming does not work for the less educated. This is as of May, which was the height of Zooming. 50 million Americans had lost their jobs because of COVID. 50 million Americans were teleworking because of the pandemic. But out of that 50 million, they were skewed overwhelmingly towards the best educated. 70% of people with an advanced degree were teleworking. 54% who had college but no advanced degree were teleworking. Only 5% of high school dropouts. Only 15% of people who just had high school degrees and nothing else. Enormous disparity in terms of this. And so a world without a face-to-face option is a world that gets rid of all of those service sector jobs that have been the bulwark of employment possibilities for less educated Americans. Next, please. We did ask firms to predict. So out of our alignable network CEOs, about 41% thought that 40% or more of their workers who switched to remote would stay remote. We also had a survey of economists from the National Association of Business Economists. Out of that group, that 36% thought that 40% or more would go remote. I think this is likely to be an intermediate thing. Probably about 10 million American workers are going to be switching a bit, maybe not 100%, but some level. That is something which in the US, given that we've added almost 10 million workers over the last 5 years to the labor force, that is something that will not be devastating to office towers because of new growth of employment. So even though you will have this switch, what will happen is that hopefully at least commercial real estate will get cheaper. New younger workers will replace older workers. There will be some replacement of residential to commercial, but cities will adapt. But make no mistake, there will be a reduction in the demand for commercial real estate in the intermediate run. We will be looking at our cities which are younger, scruffier, cheaper. Next, please. Now, I'm going to end by making a few policy recommendations, and these are things that we emphasize in our book. The first point that I'm going to make is actually not an urban point, which is this is, persistent COVID or new pandemic implies that all wealthy cities are rich. And I'm highlighting wealthy because of the idea that poor cities are going to continue to grow despite this, as the poor cities did in the 19th century. And COVID-19 was a lot less deadly than cholera was. So we need something that is a massive investment on the part of our governments. We need actually commitment to public health, and we need a global alliance that does not look like the UN, that looks like NATO. Okay, we need actually something that has serious buy-in, that recognizes this is a battle. We need to have preemptive research. We need to have preemptive ways to speed the vaccine pipeline, right? It took 2 days to develop a trial vaccine at Moderna. It took another 11 months to actually get it through the FDA's regulatory thicket, and we are still facing a completely disorganized vaccine rollout. We need global tracking to monitor outbreaks of the disease. And we probably need more aid for developing world cities to make sure that they don't breed more pandemics. Support for a virus that emerges in Wuhan can infect West Virginia. And we need a sort of global trade where we do more aid for the developing world around sanitation, and they agree to enforce hygienic rules. Next, please. NATO for Health can make that happen. If the health risks disappear, cities can thrive back. But they do face risks. The office is not dead, but it is mobile, and consequently, cities must fight for talent more than ever. Commercial space is likely to be more vulnerable than residential space because we know that the young are so hungry to get back out in their cities. Cities are likely to reallocate from the old to the young. Livability is one key to attracting talent, hence Liveable London, and millions of humans, since at least Samuel Johnson, have thought that London is the most livable place on the planet. Unfortunately, part of the economic headwinds that a city like London is going to face is that international travel is likely to be depressed for quite some time. Brexit creates challenges, but also opportunities, right? The upside of separation from the EU will vanish unless the UK takes advantage of its ability to use smart regulation and attract new businesses. And it is completely not an American's business to have any opinion whatsoever on Brexit. That was your decision. But if you have done it, then for goodness sakes, take advantage of it. Right? Use the freedom that you've gotten to do this thing to have the best regulations on the planet, because you now have the freedom to have whatever regulations you think are best. And that holds true for financial service regulations, for housing regulations, for product regulations, for any place in which you think you can do better to attract both businesses and consumers. Next, please. So I want to end with sort of 4 visions of the city. First is the city that is livable. As humanity emerges from lockdown, we are hungry for urban connection. We crave a beautiful stage and the freedom to act upon it. I often say the best development strategy, the best economic development strategy for cities is to attract smart people and then get out of their way. That is not a statement about laissez-faire. That is a statement about making sure the government does what it should do, which is to make sure the city is clean, make sure the city is safe, to fight for quality of life in the city, but not to do things that it shouldn't do, like over-regulate new businesses. It is an outrage in the US that we regulate the entrepreneurship of the poor, which occurs in the real world, so much more than we regulate the entrepreneurship of the rich, which occurs in cyberspace. Secondly, a city of technology. Right before COVID-19, cities were reacting to driverless cars, carbon change, pedestrian spaces. These possibilities still remain. Right? London can be far nimbler than the cities of the EU or even of the US. It should be. It can rival the cities of the East in doing this well. A city of opportunity, right? Cities have always been unequal places. It was Plato who wrote that every city of whatever size is in reality 2 cities, one a city of the rich and the other a city of the poor, and they are perpetually at war with one another. That inequality is okay, right? Cities attract rich people because they're fun places to be rich. Cities attract poor people because they're tolerable places to be poor. But it is only really okay if cities are fulfilling their historic mission of transforming poor people into rich people, of enabling the upwards elevator out of poverty. Too many American cities, at least, have been failing to do that. And that really requires a better approach to schooling in the US and fewer barriers to entrepreneurship. In the US, it also requires more of a rethink of crime, and I think actually the UK model is one that the US should think hard about. And finally, an affordable city. Before COVID, London had become too expensive. The only way to provide enough space, the only way that a city becomes affordable is if it builds enough. But of course, that is a challenge in London because London is a beautiful city that is part of its tremendous assets, and one needs to build in a way that does not destroy the city's historic beauty. Next, please. So let me just start with the housing point. There are no repealing the laws of supply and demand. Along the horizontal axis here, I have the amount of building that occurred between 2013 and 2000 across American metropolitan areas. Along the vertical axis, I have the relationship between the cost of buying a house and the cost of building a house. Okay, so that's a measure of how overpriced, if you will, housing is. What you can see here in the US is the places that build a lot aren't expensive, and the places that are expensive don't build a lot. Right? There's no repealing the laws of supply and demand. There's plenty of robust demand for Austin and Raleigh, but they don't become too expensive because they're cheap. These, by the way, are magnets for talent, these Sunbelt cities that are both highly skilled and very pro-entrepreneurship and pro-housing. And these are places that are nipping at the heels of San Francisco, which you can see at the other end, which is a thriving city, but it is a city that has not figured out how to enable space for middle-income Americans to find a future. Next, please. This is a graph that Paul Cheshire has kindly given me. This is the relationship between project refusal rates across UK localities and the affordability rate across England and Wales in this case. As you can see, the places that say yes more are places that have cheaper housing. Next, please. So what are some things we can do to create more freedom to flourish in housing affordability? Reduce housing costs through competition and technology, right? There needs to be the new plan that is being pushed forward, focusing on removing barriers to reducing the cost of construction, more room for competitors from outside, making sure that local builders compete vigorously with each other and with outsiders, promoting the adoption of the best new building techniques, building beautiful. The challenge is that aesthetics are often used to block new construction. One solution is to focus more on rewards, right? Reduce levies, perhaps, for architectural beauty that can be voted on by local community residents. Rebalance housing supply from demand to supply. So slowly roll down the Help to Buy policy, which in the long run, if you have a policy like Help to Buy and you have a completely inelastic supply of housing, that only pushes up prices, right? So at least restrict those policies to areas with more permissive zoning and have priority permitting. Emphasize the need to set aside as much land as quickly as possible for middle-income rental units, ideally in former brownfield sites, for example, where it's very easy to build without compromising the historic beauty of Greater London. Next, please. Communities of opportunity. One challenge is the conflict between poor residents of neighborhoods near central London and the push to add more density in those neighborhoods. One solution is to combine building with levy-funded training for local children, one-stop permitting for local businesses, and other amenities. We need to recognize that we often don't know exactly what works with disadvantaged children. We don't know how to train kids who come from difficult backgrounds all that well. We must have the humility to learn. We must engage in things which are different ways of teaching, different ways of trying to empower kids who come from difficult backgrounds and enable them to take responsibility for their own futures and to build a future for the world. We need to make sure we're eliminating barriers to entrepreneurship. One-stop permitting is something that I like, and we need to ensure that face-to-face jobs are safe. Next, please. This just shows from the US data, the right-hand side is the negative relationship between density and upward mobility in the US. The left-hand side is density and productivity. So at the same time, cities are doing a fantastic job enabling the adults in them to thrive. They're not doing a great job for their children. And one reason for this, I think, is exactly what Trevor alluded to beforehand, is that even poor adults in American cities actually live fairly integrated lives because they go to work in jobs that are usually pretty mixed. They see people who are well-educated who are part of the global economy, not the kids. The kids live in housing projects. The kids go to segregated schools. Their work is like a small, isolated village of poverty, and they grow up consequently deprived and disadvantaged. Next, please. So let me just end where I began. The COVID pandemic is a terrible thing. It is a terrible thing for the world. Cities, it has been a terrible thing for the world. But cities are the past. Cities are the future. They enable us to connect with one another. They enable us to do amazing things. to create these collaborative chains of creativity that have been working since Plato and Socrates bickered on an Athenian street corner, and that still happen in a Harvard College dorm room if we're to believe it, and created Facebook, right? Face-to-face contact is not just about creativity, it's also about joy. And I think as much as, it is a great thing to be with Trevor on Zoom, it would be much more fun to be with him in a restaurant or in a cafe. We are a social species. We crave the company of other human beings. And I can think of no city that has more capacity to bring joy, that has more capacity to be a light for the world in a post-COVID world than London. And so I think that the fight to make London and the other cities of the world more livable is one of the great challenges, the great vocations of the 21st century. And I'm so glad that Policy Exchange has included me in their part of that fight. So thank you very much.
Ed, that was fantastic. And I am so grateful to you. I have to say, I had a short-ish, and I suppose the journalistic word would be tempestuous period as chair of the London Assembly, essentially chair of the City Council. And I kind of wish that you'd been around at that point to talk to council members who I don't think quite got much of what you'd said. All right, well, look, we've got about 10, 12 minutes for questions. Anybody who wants to, please raise your hand. In the usual way, you've got the technology there. I've got a load of questions, so nobody has to ask a question if they don't want to. So I'll just fill the time until we see if anybody's got anything to say.
We have plenty to talk about, Trevor. We don't need that.
Yeah, indeed. We absolutely do. And let me start with this, Ed. I'm delighted to see that Pericles and Plato and Jon Snow all got a look in there. And I think, in a sense, all of them stood behind a very important point you made, which is that we can build infrastructure, but it's an infrastructure for humans who then have to adapt or adopt. They either have to adapt their behavior or adopt new behaviors in order to make that infrastructure work. And I'm wondering, in this particular case, there's a couple of things we need to be thinking about. Will COVID, do you think, have led to what you might call, I don't know if this is a proper expression, but it's one that occurs to me, a kind of behavioral scarring that we will have to deal with in terms of the way that people actually manage their lives and their social interaction? And secondly, if you were absolutely free to dictate, what changes in behaviors do you think we're going to need to anticipate? And what changes do you think we're going to need to encourage?
It's a great question. And I think it depends a lot on the extent to which we get rid of this thing and whether or not it comes back. So I think if vaccine rollout is relatively smooth, I think if by the summer it's gone, and with the big if we make the investments to make sure that we don't have another of these blasted things in the next 5 to 10 years, human memory is short. I think by and large, we will hopefully return to something like our previous lives and possibly even better going forward. But it's not that I don't think that we'll have several months, even a year or so of being, maybe prone to wear masks more than we were in the past, maybe prone to be more careful. But I think by and large, human beings are forgetful. What behaviors we need to adjust, the disease ones, again, really depend a lot on what things are going forward. I suspect we may be more prone to wear masks even in normal times when we have a cold or when we're around people who might have a cold. Certainly, this is the Asian experience. And one of the things that sort of really struck me in March was I was talking to a quite brilliant Chinese student of mine who now teaches at the University of Chicago, who said she just can't understand why we idiots aren't all wearing masks right now. It's like that's the first thing that they know, is that when there's any risk of this stuff, on go the masks. So I think ideally, at least our behavior will be somewhat better in the future. Now, in terms of the behavior that will change, there's a whole lot of behavior I think that we needed to change ex ante. London has been a pioneer around congestion pricing. I think you can do congestion pricing in the 21st century, which is much smarter than where you are right now. Especially as autonomous vehicles roll out, you really want congestion pricing that is real time, that is GPS based. Unsurprisingly, Singapore is leading the way on this, but traffic congestion is a bane of urban life, and pricing is the right thing to do about it. And you can get this smarter going forward. I think London's approach to crime, as I said, is something that's by and large well worth emulating. But I do think it's important that you focus. I mean, the sort of soft British touch is great in many ways, but quality of life is also important. And there needs to be a balance that makes sure that you don't wade through, filth on the way to get to the tube station. And that's sort of an important thing. Just the last thing that I think, which is really important, is that let's get through this year of isolation and just remember what a joy it is to be around other human beings. And I think just celebrating each other and celebrating the fact that, every shared laugh is a celebration, that just feels really important to me. And that if we can come out of this in a way that has less rancor and less of a sense of hatred, then we went in, that feels really first order.
Okay. Can I just ask you a very quick question about two cities that I know pretty well? You mentioned both of them, Austin and Raleigh. I wonder whether there is a danger for a world city like London. The comparators would be London, Paris, New York, Los Angeles, maybe Toronto. That Austin and Raleigh become more attractive because you can do everything and pretty much get all of the advantage you've talked about in Austin. And by the way, in Austin, what you can do is you can buy all those broken down shacks on the wrong side of the I-35 and build $1 million architect home, as well as enjoying a great life.
So all that's true, but there are things that, and I'm a big admirer of smart Sunbelt cities, but they don't have pedestrian spaces in the same way. So I think it was 2 years ago, I was at SXSW, and I remember walking around downtown Austin. And it ain't the same as walking around downtown London. There's no comparison in terms of this thing. And I think for many younger, highly skilled people, the bundle of amenities that London delivers is really second to none. That is an asset. So at the same time, I think I want London focused on, yes, you're competing. This is not a time to think that you can take any supply of global talent as given. You have to be as exciting, as sensible in your regulations, as smart in your tax policies you possibly can be. I don't think in any sense this battle is lost. And I will be surprised if London does not come out as one of the winners of this.
Okay, let's take 10 minutes of questions. First from, I'm going to ask everybody to say who they are and where they're from, and then ask a question, not so much a speech. Stephen Greenhouse. Is Stephen unmuted? I can't quite see from here.
Yep, sorry, I am now unmuted, Trevor. Apologies. Can you hear me?
Great, no problem.
Just a quick question, really. I'm struck by the importance of having a livable city, and I think on many metrics, Sydney is considered to be the most livable city, but it's not the greatest global city on earth. I think that's still London, to be honest with you, even though New York might argue with that. The issue is around livability and density. And one of the things that when I worked for the current Prime Minister's mayor, he thought about livability in terms of slightly bigger rooms. So whilst density is important, it's having a livable space when you're inside that home, although that may have an impact on price. And there was the whole idea of a Parker Boris or a Parker Morris plus 10%. Are we able to think about space standards, not just beauty, rather than creating the 21st century rabbit hutch for London? Would you agree that that's also an important policy priority?
Stephen, you might just add where you're from for Ed's benefit.
Well, I'm a minister now, Minister of State in the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, and I'm also in the Home Office, and I'm currently in the Home Office bit of I've got two offices. I'm in the nicer office.
And therefore the most important member of government on this particular question. Go ahead.
Wonderful, thank you for being here. So I think by and large, that for sure there are plenty of people who have been going through the past year who have been grateful for every square foot that they've had in their apartment. That is absolutely right. And interior space is valuable and becomes more valuable if there is a threat of COVID-19 or any other pandemic. And it is certainly true that it is an asset of Austin that it's very good at delivering lots of interior space. That's true of all of the American Sunbelt. That being said, I wouldn't have thought that requires so much regulation as it does freedom. That in fact, putting very strong lower barriers on the amount of building seems like it makes it too hard to deliver lots of different space. So I think great cities are archipelagos of neighborhoods that have, some very small apartments and some much larger ones, just because people have different tastes and you want to be able to accommodate those different spaces. But I think in general, the more that you ease building, the more that you find space, particularly in former brownfield sites, to just add a lot of real estate, the market will deliver larger homes naturally. And I certainly think that, many people, as you say, do very much think that livability means having an apartment that they don't have to squeeze into.
Sir Nicholas Kenyon, who I hope will explain who he is. Everybody here knows, but you may not. Here, oh, sorry. Okay, I was going to explain. He may come back. Sir Nicholas is Nick is the boss of one of our biggest and, in my view, best cultural centres, the Barbican Centre in the city, as well as many other things. And John Myers.
Thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Sorry.
We can hear you, John. Carry on.
Thank you. So thanks very much indeed to Professor Glaeser for as ever, a fascinating and excellent talk. I had a question on the future path of reform, and I wondered, is there any research that he would recommend on the political feasibility of different reforms to achieve the ends he's suggesting in the UK and England specifically?
It depends on what area. Certainly I would, in terms of housing, I would certainly go to Paul Cheshire for everything on this. Although Paul, like myself, has been in the housing wars for at least two decades and is well aware of the enormous difficulty of getting anything done, especially in lower density communities, which view new construction as being anathema. There's more space, I think, in urban areas. I think the UK's commitment to, the idea of something like a NATO for health is not something at all that would feel to me like it would be at odds with political needs right now. The idea of sort of opportunity districts, that's been, I'm more focused on the US side of this. I co-chaired a committee to try and create one of these things in Boston about 10 years ago. That ended up sort of devolving into the politics of who exactly, which member of the city council's district would exactly be included in it and whose wouldn't. As you can imagine, Trevor, that became the primary issue rather than what it would actually do. And the value of these parts of districts is a lot that they can involve experimentation, that you can try things and see if they can work. So, but that's a thing that's very hard to do politically. So is there a particular area of these policies that the politics and the feasibility that you're particularly interested in, or should I just say for anything political in London, I would go to Tony Travers, which is probably true.
Yeah. Okay. Has Nick got back on by any chance? No. No. Okay. I haven't got anybody else on right now, so let me just ask you one of mine, actually. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. Toby Harris. Or I should say Lord Harris.
Hello, Trevor. Good to speak to you again. It's you made some pejorative remarks about your time in the London Assembly. As your group leader at that time, I noted those. I think there's an interest. I've been really enjoyed this discussion, and it's quite clear that for any city, whether it's a great city like London or a much smaller urban centre, you've got to balance sustainable economy, growth with equity between the citizens and the nature, the environment, the livability of the area. But what interests me, and I speak as a member of the House of Lords Committee on COVID, amongst other things, have we reached a point, the number of businesses that I'm aware of who are already taken a decision to reduce their amount of central city office space has got to the stage where I almost wonder whether we've got to that moment where there's been a step change, which may be, if not impossible to recover from, one which will take quite a long time before a city returns to its prosperity. And I'd be interested in your analysis, because I think the long-term examples you gave of remote working, that was before it had really been tested to this extent. And of course, the technology has advanced even during the course of the last year. So I do wonder, will we pass that critical point and we're going to see a decline now, which wouldn't have occurred even 2 years ago?
So I think if we were talking about Cleveland, I think we would have every right to be worried about empty skyscrapers going forward. I think it all depends on the cushion that you have in the level of demand relative to the operating costs of commercial real estate. So just think about sort of how this market will play out. That what you're saying is exactly true. A whole bunch of incumbent tenants are going to reduce their demand for space. So you've got a whole bunch of commercial landlords who are sitting there saying, holy cow, I can't sit here with 30% vacancy. Let's see if I can move this space. And they're going to figure out some way to do it. Now, regulation can make that easier. So in many cases, they're going to want to be thinking about, can I convert this into some form of residential use? Can I do something else with it? And that's less regulated real estate world is going to make that easier for them. But given that London's commercial prices start so far above the level at which you'd ever say, oh, I'm just going to walk away from this property, right? The idea of large-scale vacancy just isn't in the cards. Now, will London be poorer, cheaper, younger, scruffier? Yes, absolutely, right? Will it take several years to adapt? Yes, I believe that that's the case. There will be landlords who will be very loath to accept a lower rent cut, but that will also often be done with backroom deals. They'll throw in a bit of upfront stuff. They'll rehabilitate the thing, and so it won't feel as painful as if they had actually cut rents by 30%. But it's all about whether or not the rents are high enough relative to the maintenance cost as to whether or not to actually think that you're going to get large scale vacancies. And as long as you continue to have those units being used, then the associated economy will continue to exist, right? As long as you have someone coming into those offices, then the people who sell them, crisps will be able to survive. So that, I think, in fact, I'm just not that worried about downtown London, as long as the city continues to compete, continues to be livable, continues to prioritize the need to find global talent, to empower local entrepreneurs, and to make the city work. The worry is much larger. I mean, if you want a UK context, I mean, I worry about Glasgow, right? I mean, there are parts of the UK, I worry about Liverpool. I mean, the parts of the UK where the space between commercial rents and maintenance costs are much closer than they are in London.
Okay, I think we've probably just about got to, and I'm going to ask you to wrap up for a minute, Ed. Now, I wonder if you could just deal with one thing which, oddly enough, for a think tank of our kind, hasn't come up really today, which is politics. Do you think, or let me put it another way, and this is the sort of question that somebody who's had a short but disastrous political career inevitably would ask. Do you think that the way that we do our politics and we have them structured is going to be a help to the sort of prescriptions that you're talking about, or hindrance?
Well, it's a question of relative to what. Relative to the US, it's certainly a help. I mean, you have more functional strength at the center. You have an executive branch of the national government that has much more capacity than ours does. I mean, and just to take an example, the National Health Service, for all of its flaws, is a functioning government agency, right, with the responsibility of caring for the health of every Briton. We have Medicare. Medicare is not a functioning large-scale agency. It cuts checks. It's an insurance program that was designed by the Ways and Means Committee, not designed by anyone focused on health. And so our national government, with the exception of the Army, right, has just never developed the capacity to deal with sort of large-scale national issues. And that means that in a world in which you do have large-scale national issues like COVID, we are very, very weak. There is more capacity that is devolved, and that is a difference between the US and the UK, right? We are a more federal structure, but that leads to huge amounts of unevenness. So you can have a police force in New York City that is just, enormously capable, right? And then you can have, school districts in poorer areas that are anything but, right? That level of unevenness does create some real bright spots, but it also creates competition, which is helpful, which you have less of in the UK. But it also creates just places in which there are tremendous weak links in the American safety net. So I think right now is likely to be a moment in which we actually need a common shared strength to deal with the pandemic risk that's global. And I think actually the UK centralized model is actually a good one right now going forward. So I actually think there's a lot to like there. But if you give me 5 to 10 years, I'll be again pushing for more devolved power and more cities having the ability to compete and do their own thing. But right now, I think is a moment for strong national leadership, and I think the UK model has much more ability to deliver that than the US model does.
Ed, thank you so much, and I'm going to leave it at that point because I suspect that many on this call will have quite strong views on what you've just said. But they will have an opportunity. Everybody will have an opportunity to express some of them because. After this relaunch, you will be hearing more about what we're doing on Liveable London. Both Ed and I are members of the advisory group there, and I think we are very, very strongly committed to pushing forward this agenda. Whatever happens for the rest of this year, I don't think anybody has any doubt that that one of the first items on the agenda for this administration and any future administration will be what we do about our great cities, and most importantly, amongst them, what we do in relation to London. So expect to hear more. I'm grateful to all of you for joining us, and I'm particularly grateful to Ed. I didn't say this before because it would have embarrassed him, but my own favorite and most worshipped economist, who is George Akerlof, the Nobel laureate, described Ed Glaeser as a genius. And I think we have been the beneficiaries of some of that touch of genius today. So thank you very much, Ed, and look forward to talking to you more about all of this. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Bye.
Next year.